He raised her since she was just a child, fed her breakfast before school, helped her with homework at the kitchen table, tucked her in at night, and called her his daughter. For 10 years, he was the only father she'd ever known. But then everything changed. 10 years later, he would stand beside her not as her father, but as her groom. He married the girl he raised, the girl who called him Dad. And when their secret finally came to light, it would tear apart an entire community and force us all to ask one terrifying question: where does a father's love end and something else begin? This is the story of Michael and Emily, a story that starts with what looked like rescue and ends with betrayal so deep, so calculated, that even seasoned investigators couldn't believe what they uncovered. Before we dive deep into this story, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss any of our upcoming videos, because what you're about to hear will make you question everything you thought you knew about trust, family, and the fine line between protection and possession. Stay with me, because the truth about this relationship shocked even the judge who had to rule on it. Who was Michael Harrison, really? Back in 2008, when he first entered their lives, he seemed like the answer to a struggling family's prayers. Michael was 35 years old, a quiet man who worked as a mechanic at the local auto shop in Riverside, Ohio. He'd been divorced once before, no kids of his own, and by all accounts he kept to himself. Neighbors described him as polite, hardworking, the kind of guy who'd help you change a tire in the rain without asking for anything in return. He wasn't flashy, didn't drink much, went to church on Sundays, the kind of man who blended into small-town America so seamlessly that no one thought to look closer. Then there was Linda Martinez, 32 years old, a single mother working 2 jobs just to keep the lights on. She waited tables at the diner during the day and cleaned offices at night. Linda had a 5-year-old daughter named Emily, a bright-eyed little girl with brown curls and a smile that could light up a room. Emily's biological father had left before she turned 2, just vanished one day and never came back. So Linda did what she had to do. She worked herself to exhaustion to give her daughter a stable life, even if it meant she barely saw her some days. Every penny she earned went toward that little girl. Every decision she made was about giving Emily the childhood she herself never had. Michael and Linda met at the diner where she worked. He'd come in for coffee during his lunch breaks, always sitting at the same booth by the window. They started talking, and over weeks those conversations grew longer. Michael learned about Linda's struggles, about the father who'd abandoned his family, about the nights Linda cried herself to sleep, worrying how she'd pay rent. And he listened, really listened. When he finally asked her out, Linda hesitated. She'd been hurt before, and she had Emily to think about, but there was something about Michael that felt safe, steady. Like finally, after years of chaos, here was someone who wouldn't run. They dated for 8 months before Michael proposed. They were married in a small ceremony at the courthouse with Emily as the flower girl. She wore a white dress Linda had saved for months to buy, and she held Michael's hand as they walked out together. In that moment, everything felt right. Like the happy ending Linda had prayed for was actually real. Michael moved into their small 2-bedroom house on Maple Street. Almost overnight, everything changed for Emily and her mother. Suddenly, there was food in the refrigerator that lasted the whole week. The heat stayed on during winter. He'd pick Emily up from kindergarten, take her to the park, teach her how to ride a bike. On her 6th birthday, he surprised her with a puppy, a golden retriever she named Buddy. Emily adored him. She started calling him Dad within the first year, and Michael never corrected her. He seemed to embrace the role completely, but if you'd looked closely, you might have noticed something. Small things. The way Michael's jaw tightened when Linda made plans with her girlfriends. How he'd suggest, gently at first, that maybe she didn't need to go out so much, that family time was more important. The way he kept track of Linda's schedule, always knowing where she was, who she was with, how long she'd be gone. Linda's sister, Maria, noticed. She mentioned it once, said something felt off about how controlling he could be. But Linda dismissed it. After years of doing everything alone, It felt good to have someone who cared enough to pay attention. Maria dropped it. And maybe, she thought, she was reading too much into it. After all, Michael seemed like such a good father to Emily. The years passed quietly. Emily grew from a little girl into a bright, curious child. She did well in school, made friends easily, loved to draw and write stories. Michael was there for all of it. Every parent-teacher conference, every school play, every science fair project. He'd sit with her at the kitchen table for hours, helping her with homework. He was patient in a way Linda had never seen before. He never raised his voice, never showed anger. Emily lived for his approval, for the way his face would light up when she brought home a good report card. Linda couldn't have been happier. Finally, she thought, Emily had the father figure she deserved. But what Linda didn't know was that inside Michael's mind, something was shifting. The way he looked at Emily was changing. The thoughts he had about her were becoming something no father should ever think about his child. And he was careful, so careful, to make sure no one suspected a thing. Then everything fell apart. Emily was 13 years old when Linda started feeling sick. At first it seemed like nothing serious: fatigue, headaches, loss of appetite. But the symptoms got worse. After weeks of tests, the diagnosis came back: stage 3 ovarian cancer. Aggressive, already spreading. The doctor gave her 2 years at best. Linda was 38 years old. The news devastated their family. The treatments were brutal. Chemotherapy left Linda weak and sick, barely able to get out of bed some days. She had to quit her job. Medical bills piled up. And through it all, Michael stepped up. He took care of everything, drove Linda to her treatments, made sure Emily got to school, cooked meals, cleaned the house, paid the bills. To everyone watching, he was a saint. The devoted husband caring for his dying wife. The dedicated stepfather protecting his stepdaughter from the worst of the trauma. No one could have asked for more. But behind closed doors, something else was happening. With Linda spending more and more time in the hospital, Michael and Emily were alone together constantly. He'd help her with homework late into the night. They'd watch movies together. He'd sit on the edge of her bed and talk to her about her fears, about how scared she was of losing her mother. And he was there, always there, with comfort and reassurance. He told her she was strong, told her she was special, told her that no matter what happened, he would never leave her, never abandon her the way her real father had. The conversation started to change, subtly at first. Michael would tell Emily how mature she was for her age, how she wasn't like other girls who were shallow and silly. He'd say she understood things most adults didn't understand. He'd share intimate details about his feelings, his past, his fears, things he said he couldn't share with anyone else. He created this bubble around the two of them, this sense that they had a connection no one else could understand. And Emily, isolated by her mother's illness, with friends who couldn't possibly relate to what she was going through, believed him. She felt special, chosen. She didn't realize she was being groomed. Linda passed away 18 months after her diagnosis. It was a Tuesday morning in March. Emily was 14 years old. She held her mother's hand as she took her last breath, Michael standing silent behind her. When they walked back into the house on Maple Street after the funeral, the silence was deafening. Emily broke down in the living room, sobbing so hard she couldn't breathe, and Michael held her. Told her it would be okay. Told her he was there. Told her he'd take care of her. Always. What happened over the next year is where this story gets truly disturbing. Michael became Emily's legal guardian. There was no question about it. Linda's will named him, and Maria, despite her reservations, didn't fight it. She had 3 kids of her own and couldn't take in another child. Michael made sure Emily stayed in school, kept up with her therapy appointments, made her breakfast every morning and dinner every night. From the outside, he was doing everything right. But inside that house, the dynamic was shifting in ways no one could see. Michael started telling Emily things that made her uncomfortable, though she didn't have the language yet to explain why. He'd say she was the only person who really understood him, that their bond was special, deeper than most people could comprehend. He'd get upset if she wanted to spend time with friends, would guilt her by saying he thought they were closer than that. He'd talk about how lonely he was now that Linda was gone, and Emily, desperate to ease his pain and terrified of losing the only parent she had left, tried to be whatever he needed. She started pulling away from her friends, stopped going to school events, came straight home every day and stayed in the house with Michael. He'd watch movies with her every night, sitting close on the couch, closer than felt comfortable, but not so close that she could articulate why it felt wrong. He'd brush her hair back from her face when they talked, let his hand linger on her shoulder, tell her she was beautiful, but in a way that felt different from how a father should say it. On her 16th birthday, everything changed. Michael took her out to dinner at a nice restaurant in the next town over. He gave her a necklace, a delicate silver chain with a heart pendant. He told her she wasn't a little girl anymore, told her she was becoming a woman, and that he saw her differently now. He reached across the table and took her hand, and the way he looked at her made Emily's stomach twist. He kissed her that night, in the car in their driveway before they went inside. It wasn't a fatherly kiss on the forehead, it was on the lips, brief but unmistakable in its intent. Emily froze, didn't know how to react, and what did Emily do? She smiled, not because she wanted to, but because she was 16 years old, and this was the man who'd raised her, who'd taken care of her, who'd been there through the worst time of her life. She was afraid of what would happen if she rejected him. So she smiled, and that smile was all the permission Michael needed. Their relationship changed after that night. Michael started calling it love. He'd tell Emily that what they had was special, that most people wouldn't understand it, that society would judge them, but that didn't make it wrong. He made it sound romantic, inevitable, like they were star-crossed lovers fighting against an unjust world. And Emily, who desperately wanted to believe there was meaning in her suffering, tried to believe him. But it wasn't love, because love doesn't come from someone who's held power over you since you were 5 years old. Love doesn't come from someone who isolated you from everyone else in your life. What Michael was doing had a name, and that name was grooming. They kept the sexual nature of their relationship secret for 2 more years. Emily finished high school living in that house with Michael, carrying this enormous secret. She couldn't tell anyone. Michael had made it clear that if anyone found out, they'd be separated, that he could go to jail, that she'd end up in foster care. So she stayed silent. When Emily turned 18, Michael told her they could finally be together openly. 6 months later, when Emily was 19, Michael proposed. He got down on one knee in their living room, the same living room where she used to do puzzles with him and her mother. And Emily, who'd spent years being told this was love, who'd been isolated from everyone who might have helped her see the truth, who'd been groomed so thoroughly she couldn't separate her own thoughts from the ones Michael had planted there, said yes. They didn't get married in Riverside. Michael knew that would cause problems. Instead, they drove to a neighboring state where the laws were less stringent. They got married in a courthouse with 2 strangers as witnesses. Emily wore a simple white dress. The ceremony took less than 15 minutes. They didn't tell anyone at first, but secrets like that don't stay hidden in small towns. Someone recognized Michael at the courthouse. The gossip started small, just whispers. But then someone found their marriage certificate. It's public record. And once people saw in black and white that Michael Harrison had married Emily Martinez, the girl he'd raised since she was 5 years old, the town exploded. The reactions were visceral. People were disgusted, outraged, horrified. Social media lit up with posts calling Michael a predator, a monster, demanding he be arrested. Emily's Aunt Maria broke down when she heard the news. The church kicked Michael out. His boss fired him. People spray-painted words on their house. Someone threw a brick through their window. But Michael had anticipated this. He told Emily this was exactly what he'd warned her about, that people were small-minded and judgmental, and Emily, surrounded by fury and condemnation, clung to him even tighter. She defended him publicly, insisted they were in love, that everyone else should mind their own business. The local police started getting calls demanding an investigation. The problem was proving anything. Emily wasn't talking. She insisted nothing inappropriate had happened until after her 18th birthday. Michael stuck to the same story. Without evidence, without a victim willing to testify, there wasn't much the police could do. Legally, the marriage was valid, disturbing, but valid. The case stalled. That might have been the end of it, except a local reporter named Jessica Chen decided to look deeper. She requested records, interviewed neighbors, talked to Emily's old teachers, and then she got a tip from someone who'd worked at the library. They remembered Michael coming in regularly when Emily was younger, using the computers there. Public computers keep logs. Jessica filed a request for those records, and what she found changed everything. Michael had been careless. Years ago, when Emily was still 13 and 14 years old, he'd used those library computers to access online forums where men talked about their attraction to underage girls, forums where they shared strategies for grooming children, for building dependence, for making girls feel like the inappropriate relationship was their idea. And Michael had been active in these forums. He'd posted dozens of times, describing his situation, asking for advice, talking about Emily in ways that made his intentions crystal clear. He'd written about how he was laying the groundwork, how he was being patient, how he knew if he just waited until she was legal, no one could stop them. The posts were time-stamped, tied to library login records that confirmed they'd been made during times when Michael had signed in. Jessica published her findings. The evidence was damning and impossible to deny. Michael wasn't just a man who'd fallen in love with his stepdaughter after she became an adult. He was a predator who'd targeted a vulnerable child and spent years systematically grooming her. Those forum posts proved premeditation. They proved intent. The district attorney reopened the investigation with new charges: grooming a minor with intent to abuse, child endangerment, corruption of a minor. In one post, Michael had written, "She's 13 now and starting to develop. I've been her dad for 8 years, so she trusts me completely. I know I need to be patient, but it's hard. I've started telling her how special she is, how mature, planting seeds. In 5 years she'll be legal, and she'll think it was her idea all along." That post alone was enough to convince a jury of his guilt. The trial lasted 3 weeks. Michael was convicted on multiple counts and sentenced to 12 years in prison. The judge said Michael had committed one of the most calculated, patient crimes she'd ever seen. He'd spent a decade building a prison around Emily, except the bars were made of trust and affection and manufactured emotional dependency. She said he'd stolen Emily's childhood, her autonomy, her ability to know what she wanted, separate from what he'd conditioned her to want. People cheered when the sentence was announced, but Emily wasn't there. She'd stopped coming after the first day of trial, unable to face what the evidence revealed about her own life. The court also annulled their marriage. The judge ruled that consent couldn't be valid when it was the product of years of grooming. Legally, their marriage had never existed. Emily was free, except she didn't feel free. In the months after Michael's conviction, she disappeared from public view, deleted her social media, stopped answering calls from anyone who tried to reach out. No one knew where she was or how she was doing. Then, 2 years after Michael went to prison, Emily broke her silence. She wrote a letter that was published in a local newspaper. In it, she described what her life had been like, how she'd spent every day since the trial trying to figure out who she was apart from what Michael had made her. She wrote about finally understanding what had been done to her, how the grooming had worked, how she'd been so completely controlled that she hadn't even recognized it as control. She talked about the shame she felt, not just about the relationship, but about how she'd defended him, how she'd pushed away everyone who tried to help her. But the most powerful part of her letter was the end. Emily wrote that she wanted people to understand that victims of grooming often don't look like victims. They defend their abusers. They insist they're in love. They push away help because they've been conditioned to believe the abuser is the only person who really cares about them. She wrote that if her story could help one person recognize the signs of grooming, then maybe something good could come from all this pain. She ended with, "I was 5 years old when I met Michael. I'm 24 now. For 19 years he's been part of my life. I'm finally learning what it means to be free of him. It's the hardest thing I've ever done, but I'm doing it. Michael is still in prison. He'll be eligible for parole in 6 more years. Emily has reportedly moved to a different state and changed her name. She's in college now, studying psychology, planning to work with trauma survivors. Her Aunt Maria says they're slowly rebuilding their relationship, that Emily is finally starting to heal. But the scars from what Michael did run deep. Emily is working to reclaim herself, to figure out who she might have been if Michael had never entered her life. So I want to ask you something. Think about this story. Really think about it. How many times did someone have a chance to intervene and didn't? How many signs were missed or ignored or dismissed? Linda's sister had concerns but didn't push. Emily's teachers saw her withdrawing but chalked it up to grief. Neighbors noticed the relationship seemed unusually close but didn't say anything because who wants to accuse someone of something so horrible without proof? We all want to believe the best about people. But that's exactly what predators count on. They hide behind normalcy and patience and social politeness. Think about Emily at different stages of this story. At 5 years old, meeting the man who would destroy her life. At 13, starting to feel uncomfortable, but not understanding why. At 16, being kissed by the only father she'd ever known and feeling obligated to accept it. At 19, marrying her abuser because she'd been so thoroughly manipulated she thought it was love. At 24, finally understanding what was done to her. At what point could this have been stopped? The truth is, he was grooming her from the very beginning. Every bedtime story, every homework session, every moment of trust he built was part of the plan. He was playing a long game, and he was patient. And what about the people who defended their relationship, who said it was none of anyone's business, that she was an adult and could make her own choices? Where's the line between respecting autonomy and protecting people from abuse? What happens when someone's entire concept of consent has been shaped by years of manipulation? When the foundation of the relationship is a gross imbalance of power that started when one person was a child? Does that consent mean anything? Michael destroyed Emily's life. He took a vulnerable child who'd lost her father and was about to lose her mother, and he used that vulnerability to shape her into what he wanted. He stole her teenage years. He stole her ability to develop normal relationships. He stole her sense of self. And he did it all while presenting himself as her protector. That's the cruelest part. Emily trusted him completely, believed he was keeping her safe, and all along, he was the greatest danger she faced. The question this story leaves us with isn't just about Michael and Emily. It's about all of us. How do we protect children from people who have this kind of patience and planning? How do we spot grooming when it's happening slowly over years? How do we create a culture where people feel empowered to speak up when something feels wrong? And how do we support victims who've been so thoroughly manipulated they defend their abusers? Emily's story matters because it shows us how abuse can hide in plain sight, how predators can be patient, how grooming works, and how devastating the consequences can be when we miss the signs or choose not to see them. So, what do you think? Could this have been prevented? Were there moments when someone should have stepped in? And if you saw signs of grooming happening to someone you knew, what would you do? Would you speak up even if it meant being wrong? Even if it meant making someone angry? These aren't comfortable questions, but Michael's conviction and Emily's long journey toward healing prove they're questions we can't afford to ignore. This story isn't just about one man and one girl. It's about how love, when twisted into possession and control, becomes the opposite of love. It's about power and vulnerability and the responsibility we all have to protect those who can't protect themselves.